Welcome to the College Football Survivor Show, where playoff survival is always on the line. Here's Shehan J. Haraja and Bobak Hayeri.
Hey everybody, it's the College Football Survivor Show. I'm Bobak Hayeri with my co-host Shehan J. Haraja, national college football writer for CBS Sports. We are glad to have you joining us today. So we're going to take a look at the results of Week 9 as we try to figure out who stays in our survivor pool. Plus, some discussion on whether or not we should be worried about two of the teams that did win, but kind of closer than expected, Ohio State and Texas. But before we dive in, let me remind you that you can find us on X and TikTok at CFB Survivor Show, where we have video highlights of the show, run polls, and listen to your feedback. Take a second to like, rate, and subscribe to us wherever you find us. We always enjoy those moments of reading what some of you have taken time to write. So, all of that said, welcome to Week 8. Oh, well, Week 9, pardon me. Week 10. It's Week 10. I love that. I swear, things keep flying by. I cannot believe November's around the corner. But, Sean, how are you doing?
I'm doing well. Yeah, we're getting down to the grindstone. Next week, actually, we have our first college football playoff rankings coming out. Actually, we might need to talk about that on Thursday's show. Just kind of set the scene just a little bit. But no, it's been a great couple of weeks. I just got back yesterday from LSU at Texas A&M, which obviously was an insane game. It's my first on-campus game of the year, and it was a very good one to go to, the third biggest in Kyle Field history. And look, I mean, we didn't really have a great feel of what was going to happen this week. Unfortunately, we were exactly right to pick Texas A&M to be the team that made it into our field, and it makes our job this week just a little bit harder.
Yeah, that is fascinating, though. I mean, I think you were at probably one of the most exciting games of the week. I mean, with the quarterback change, we'll probably get into that a little bit more, maybe perhaps later. But yeah, as for those of you who are here, our last week's episode on our Tuesday episode, we were deciding behind that. Sean was like, "Let's put an LSU," and I was able to convince him with A&M, and I guess I was, I didn't plan on being right for this way, but my goodness. Oh, by the way, one thing I noticed since we've been doing this now for about a year as a co-host. I just realized that. It was roughly last week, this week. I wasn't paying attention, but I'm like, I remember we did our first college football playoff post-show kind of thing, and man, that was me super early in the morning in Vegas. I remember that vividly. But all of that said, so just to kind of run down, we always start our first show of the week looking over our pool of college football survivors. And we have a grand total of 12. We could have a maximum of 12. But each week, no matter what, even if they all win, we have to vote at least one off each week. We can vote more than one off. But again, if we have a situation where all the teams win, things get trickier. We get to be a little bit more reactionary. And again, after we figure out who we're voting off, we figure out who we're going to replace them with. And with this 12-team playoff, we have some slight tweaks we've made. There's always going to be a member of each of the P4 because we assume at least someone's going to make it. And again, the top four teams the top four conference finishers are going to be seeded 1 through 4. And we are going to always include a G5 program because, again, there's always going to be a fifth conference champ. Presumably, it'll be the G5 champ in most years, filling out the top 12 potentially. So if any one of those teams gets voted out, they have to be replaced by another team. And if it is the G5 team that we vote off, we will still go back and choose from the other 11 teams to figure out who we're going to replace it with. So we're not every week picking on the G5 program. But once again, that's probably not going to happen this week because Boise State was a tight game, but an expected game to be that close against UNLV in Las Vegas. So again, we'll look into all of this. We've had a couple of teams that may have played themselves out of it. I always like looking at that. I don't know why. I just want to say, Mizzou probably played themselves out of conversation for a while. Illinois, that's what you get when you play Oregon. LSU, potentially. Duke, probably. Syracuse, some people say Kyle McCord is still throwing picks to this day. Navy is probably still dropping the ball somewhere. And Liberty, went from bye week to bye. And I'm not saying I don't think gleeing teams losing, but man, it's a relief because I was so worried that we were going to somehow end in some G5, anarchy that was going to end up with, the team that keeps betting $1 in the Price is Right showcase. But how are you doing? I mean, what are your thoughts on this week?
Yeah, it's an interesting week. Obviously, we have, I think, a tough job to do putting together our list of teams to try to vote off of the show was really, really difficult, honestly. I think that there isn't an obvious team that deserves to be taken off, but at the same time, like, this is the show. This is the Survivor show. Somebody has to be voted off. So, for me, we're getting to the point of like every week provides the opportunity for a misstep. Like that's the reality of it. I look, for example, at a game like Oregon, Michigan. Oregon should win. Oregon's favored by 15 and a half points. But if Michigan pulls it off, that's a huge deal. The big game of the week that I'm sure we will go very in depth on the later week show is Ohio State at Penn State. Like that might be for Ohio State an elimination game. Like if they're a two-loss team with losses to Oregon and Penn State, I don't know if that kicks them completely out, but like it makes their job a whole lot tougher if they're not playing in the Big Ten title game, if they're not competing nationally in that way. And for them to lose two regular season games under Ryan Day would be pretty inconceivable with what they came into the season with. And by the way, if Nebraska's any indication, I think that like they're gettable, especially right now on offense with their inconsistency. Like they are gettable at times. So again, like this is what we're heading towards. Every single week now, heading into the month of November, has a chance to really throw everything on its head.
Yeah, I mean, you were talking about that spread between Michigan and Oregon. I mean, Ohio State was favored by like 25 and a half against Nebraska, and Nebraska put the fear in them. And of course, Nebraska also got blown out by Indiana previously. We'll talk a little bit more about this way this all balances out, probably in the latter half of the show when we talk about our concerns about potentially Ohio State and Texas. Just a rundown who we had this week as or coming out into last weekend as our survivor pool. We had Oregon, which of course had no trouble against number 20 Illinois. Georgia, which took a nice bye week after blowing out Texas previously. Penn State had an interesting game we might want to talk about at Wisconsin and Camp Randall. They did pull it off 28-13. Of course, they have their game at number 4, Ohio State. Ohio State, as we just mentioned, had a 21-17 win against Nebraska. They're playing it's funny too to also think about this. This is the second time they're playing the number 3 team in the country. With the first time was Oregon, which is now number 1. Now they're going to, of course, be going to Happy Valley to play Penn State. Miami had no trouble with Florida State, so this was a nice week to see Miami just kind of coast. And we kind of talked about that. They savored that opportunity to kind of probably not upset, but dump on the Noles, I should say. Number 6, Texas. They had an interesting game at Vandy, and Vandy's been an interesting team. They were ranked 25, and I think they only just fell to like 26, so they're just out of the rankings now. So again, good for Texas there to survive. BYU had no problem in UCF. Like we had a reporter down there on RCFB, and they pretty much dominated the stadium in every manner. So again, BYU, no problems there. We had Texas A&M, who we had just added, and they proved their worth by beating LSU in that great, exciting game that, of course, Shehan covered. Clemson had a bye week. Iowa State had a bye week. Coincidentally, they're tied in the AP poll. Indiana had no trouble, even though they were hosting game. All the excitement was on them. They had no trouble with Washington winning 31-17. And finally, we had Boise State, 29-24 over UNLV, an exciting game. And that's our group. So we have those 12 teams. We have to pick one of them to eliminate. This isn't easy. All of them won, and it's hard to win. I mean, I'm just going to say that right now. It's hard to win. But who cares? Let's kick someone off. What do you think?
Yeah, this is really, really difficult. So obviously, I think that all of the teams that we put up for a poll are legitimate national championship contenders. You got Texas, you got Ohio State, you got Penn State. Any of them truly could win the national championship this year.
By the way, I love someone responded, why would you kick any of them off? And it's like, yeah, no, that's not the point of the show, but we do get it why, if you're an objective person, might wonder why are you even bringing these 3 up?
Yes. And I will say too, right, our legacy, because of our previous co-host, Doug Maurice, we have quite an Ohio State following, especially on our social media accounts. So we got a little extra of, why are you doing this? What are you doing right now? But sometimes we've talked about it. Usually it's after a loss. but sometimes teams just need to be put in timeout for a little bit. And so when I look at what's happened so far, so here's the situation for all of them, right? Let's go through all three. And this is just talking resume. This isn't looking forward. Penn State, so far, their resume is all right. They have a win over Illinois, 21-7. Pretty solid overall. USC and Wisconsin aren't bad wins, but certainly not a whole lot to write home about. I think that West Virginia felt a little bit more impressive a few weeks ago than it does right now. West Virginia really hasn't done all that much, for being honest. Then moving over to Texas. I mean, Texas looked like they were going to have a monster of an early schedule. And then Oklahoma decided to be a bottom 3 team in the SEC. Michigan decided to be maybe not even a bowl team this year. They did get a legitimate win over Vanderbilt. That's like not a bad win, 27-24 this past week, but that's their resume right now is a 3-point win over Vanderbilt.
I just have to say, their other with the win we thought might have been good, ULM, they just go and get blown out by South Alabama. So that was actually one of the they were the only.
What I will say is that they have to this point beaten 7 teams. So Vanderbilt again, pretty nice win. Out of the other 6, ULM is the most likely to make a bowl still out of the rest of that group. Wow. Colorado State, UTSA, it hurts my heart, but UTSA looks terrible. ULM looks like they're going to make a bowl. Mississippi State will not. Oklahoma is right on the borderline. And Michigan, I think that they find a way to make it to a bowl game, but like you can't say that you feel good about that right now with the way that they're playing and the struggles that they've had. They were very lucky to be able to get past Michigan State this week, and they do have Northwestern, so they'll probably make a bowl. But they also play 3 of the top 15 teams in the country over the next 4 weeks, so like it's not going to be awesome necessarily. So that's Texas's resume. Ohio State is just very weird for me to try to understand because, you know, we had, of course, the Texas-Georgia game is the one that we didn't mention on their resume. Ohio State played Oregon on the road within 1 point. Mm-hmm. Like, it was a much, quote-unquote, better loss than what Texas obviously did against Georgia. I also think, generally speaking, I think that Georgia's probably better than Oregon, but that's beside the point. But they're, like, this game against Nebraska was, like, everything that you're concerned about with this team. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later. But Iowa, of course, you know, they're fine this year at Michigan State. The rest of their non-conference schedule: Marshall, Western Michigan, Akron. It's 3 really bad teams. So, like, I think that their resume is probably the worst of the group. They've been a little more dominant in their other games until these past 2 weeks. I don't know. I really go back and forth about this. Do you now? Okay, what I will say is, you know, whenever we talk about the College Football Playoff Committee, they do take into account the idea of an injury changing a team fundamentally. Last year, it was Jordan Travis at Florida State who went out, and Florida State's offense kind of fell apart. Turns out Jordan Travis might have been the greatest college football player of all time, if the 2024 Florida Seminoles are to be believed at this point. But I think that Ohio State has a potentially game-changing injury, and that's their left tackle, Josh Simmons. He went out against Oregon, and not all of, but some of their struggles at the end of the Oregon game were after losing Josh Simmons. This past week against Nebraska, you look at the way that they struggled on offense. In the second half, they had the game-winning touchdown drive, and that's real. That matters. That's real. But other than that, it was punts and interceptions in the second half for them. So I do think that out of these 3 teams, the one that, in my mind, probably needs to be benched right now, and it might just be for a week, and they can play their way back in literally this Saturday. Yeah. I think it's Ohio State.
You know, that is an interesting way of phrasing it, because I think certainly of the teams, they have the ones most able to come in and come right back. And we've seen that again. with certain teams. Now, Penn State, I think if you're undefeated at this point and you're riding through, what happened at Wisconsin was just a mess because obviously they had an injury to Drew Aller. They were able to keep that game together. Wisconsin was sensing blood in the water. I was actually at a bar with a bunch of Wisconsin fans during that game. So like they weren't my
Wisconsin fans at a bar. Has that ever happened?
Yeah, so it was. I was watching them like losing their marbles during that game, and you felt good for them.
I will say too, Penn State was down when Drew Aller went out, right? So they actually came back, and I think they would have come back regardless.
Yeah, they did against USC. Really, so I mean, we've seen them do it before. Yeah. So certainly that was. So again, that one. I feel a little bit. I don't feel like they've put themselves in a position to vote off the island. I certainly agree that having issues on the offensive line when you're about to play Penn State's defense is a bit of an eyebrow raiser. Now, Texas, I'm also worried about Texas because they didn't lose the same way as Ohio State did. They hosted Georgia and got really wrecked by Georgia. It wasn't a close loss where you can kind of forgive Will Howard for making just an error. Sometimes it happens. They're still young men. In the final waning seconds of the game, Georgia just came and absolutely clobbered them. And then to see the Vanderbilt game immediately afterwards, it was closer. I mean, if Vanderbilt had pulled it off, it would have been like, oh my gosh, this is almost similar to what happened in Alabama there, except they barely beat Georgia, and then Georgia came back as we remember in that game, and then suddenly they slipped on a banana peel immediately afterwards and fell to Vanderbilt. I'm a little more concerned about that. Of course, Texas does get a week off before they play Florida, so maybe they'll get a chance to kind of turn things around a bit. Ohio State, I was favoring Texas here, but I know our fans on X have put Ohio State ahead of Texas in this conversation. So I would get outvoted either way, and I'm okay with that because I think Ohio State has a better opportunity this next week to put up or shut up. Because if they lose to Penn State, I don't know what their route is at that point. I mean, first of all, we haven't even had a chance to talk about Indiana, but Indiana like wrecking Nebraska, which nearly knocks off
56-7.
I mean, what is going on? Indiana, I feel bad for the Hoosiers because they are in that. They're like Pitt. They're almost the same in the sense where like, yeah, but we keep wanting to do a yeah, but with them. But Indiana could very well beat Ohio State. And then if that happens, can you imagine a third loss? I couldn't before they even get to Michigan. I can't. Not that Michigan. I'm necessarily doing. Hey, Buckeyes. I'm not saying I'm putting any money on the Wolverines here, but my goodness, that would be chaos. So I think I'm okay with that. I will say, let the record say, I thought Texas was probably more likely to be removed at this point, but I am fine with removing Ohio State at this point. I don't think that's a huge issue because we'll see real quick if the Buckeyes can stay in this.
Yeah, it feels weird. I can't imagine. Now, look, obviously in the previous iteration of this show, it was a 4-team playoff. I don't know if Ohio State has ever not been in our field. Like, I don't know if that's ever happened before. I'm trying to think like maybe like week 2 of the 2021 season. I'm trying to even remember. Yeah, I think that we had just started the show at that point when Ohio State lost to Oregon behind a Joe Moorhead masterclass. So maybe they weren't in for like a few weeks there, but like that's probably it. And you mentioned it. Our voters, it was really close. This is actually a great vote. 36.9% of our voters said Ohio State, narrowly beating out 32.3% for Texas and 30.8% for Penn State. So, again, it's really close. I think that, to me, if you're talking about the team, and this is not necessarily what the vote is, right? Like sometimes you just, in this format, you just have to get punished. But if you're asking me which team of the 3 right now is the biggest lock for the playoffs, I would probably say Penn State. Like, I would probably say Penn State because they're going to play Ohio State. But other than that, like, I don't think that there's another team that's poised to challenge them all that much. I mean, if you look at their closing schedule after Ohio State, in fact, there's not a team that should even be close. Washington at Purdue at Minnesota versus Maryland. You can go watch them do some stuff on November 23rd in Minnesota, but other than that, I don't know that anybody's going to necessarily need to see a lot from them over these next couple of weeks. And if you're an 11-1 team in the Big Ten, like I think you're in. I think you're in decent shape to be in. And the other thing about Penn State too is that fair or not, I mean, we talked about their resume. I think that they don't have necessarily anything all that impressive on their resume. Like they beat a top 25-ish Illinois team, and that's kind of the whole thing. But like if you're in the Big Ten, you're just going to get that credit. You already started as high as you did. You're number 3 in the AP poll. People talk about you a certain kind of way. The advanced metrics generally like them. I mean, I think that Penn State, like regardless of what happens this weekend, is probably in. I don't think that's true of Ohio State. And I think it's complicated for Texas.
Isn't it
Texas
remarkable?
only has,
It is
yeah,
remarkable that Texas and Ohio State are in this equal position where
yes,
just the overall conversation around them is, they've actually lost some pivotal games where if they drop another, I think everyone's coming to terms with the 12-team playoff. That just because your brand name is there doesn't mean you're guaranteed to be in. I mean, the resumes that said, I think people going in were like, oh, you could be a 3-loss team and get in. And now people are like, are you sure? Even a 2-loss team. Are you sure? Because again, what we're seeing, the life we're seeing in the ACC, the chaos of the Big 12, and frankly, the excitement even in the G5 has got people going like, you know what? It would be maybe it's actually getting, because we've said people are going to pay attention to more games now. It is many more games are playoff relevant now. Boise State with 1 loss at UNLV was playoff relevant. And I think the more people see other games or pay attention to what's happening, the more they're likely to say like, you know what? Let's not just pencil in Ohio State. Let's not just pencil in Texas. They're gonna have to really prove it in these final couple of weeks, and that is fantastic. I think that is wonderful for the sport. But yeah, it is really weird to see because it feels different, and I'm not even used to it. I know no one's used to it.
Yeah, it's I think going to be a lot more interesting than people realize. Look, we always get a lot of mileage out of the first college football playoff rankings release, and I think that it'll be interesting. We have to have our offline conversations about how exactly we're going to handle all that, because by the way, it's going to be election night, and so there might be a lot going on in your media diet. But I mean, we're going to learn a lot about how the committee sees these teams, frankly, next week. Like that's the biggest thing is maybe if, let's say, Penn State loses this game against Ohio State, maybe they'll be number 11. Like maybe Indiana will be number 2. We have no idea necessarily how the committee is going to handle some of these things. Again, we'll probably preview it on next week's early show, but it'll be fascinating. Honestly, I'm really curious to see how this all happens.
Yeah, I do love the hubris of the college football playoff. Not only the first show during the election, but then the national championship is on Inauguration Day. It's they're single-handedly calling out the president of the United States, whoever it is. They're calling them out and saying like, you're second to us.
It's just like, dude, can you not do this on Monday for 1 week? Can you not do this? Can you do this at 3 p.m.? Like, why are we doing it that night? Yeah. Like, nobody's gonna watch this thing. Are you trying to hide? I don't get it. It just like, I mean, I get that you as a sport have to not take a backseat to like, you have to be willing to commit, but like, this is different, right? Like this is different. This is the literal presidential
election. And it's
election.
not even to please a TV partner, because ESPN's kind of like, you guys really want to keep doing this on this day? That's usually the night where they put like the really funny game where they'll try. I still remember election night 2016 only because listening to Taylor Atlas try to call a football game as a color guy, a boxing expert, was fantastic. And I kind of made me wish they would try more wacky, as I've said, but I'll always go back to that because that was still one of the wackiest MAC games I've ever seen.
Yeah. Well, no, and by the way, the playoff ranking reveal will lead into Miami of Ohio at Ball State on ESPN. So like it's just I don't know what we're doing here. This is such a bad idea. So, we'll wait and see. Obviously, whether we're able to get our instant reaction, and maybe we'll do a short one. But
Yeah.
it's such a weird idea.
My goodness. So we have eliminated Ohio State. I don't think there's any other teams that we really need to bring up after we had to eliminate one. I made it sound like we
Yes.
have successfully done our plan, but we have removed Ohio State. Now, optionally, we could add someone to take their place. One thing that has been fascinating this past week did eliminate some of the other contenders, and we mentioned them in the outset. So, and again, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. I have a couple of teams in mind to maybe talk about. We have, of course, Tennessee. They had a bye week, but they had that great win over Alabama the previous week. In the AP, they're number 7. They only have one loss, that weird loss they had earlier. Kansas State, again, their only loss was to BYU. They had a very hot, close, but, it's a rivalry game, sundown showdown with Kansas at home. They extended, their band director said it has now, that streak of theirs can now get a driver's license at 16 years strong. Their next upcoming game is going to be at Houston. Number 20 SMU is really intriguing because, first of all, they had a sort of ACC elimination game with Duke. It was overtime. SMU tried every way to lose that game with the number of turnovers they had, but they won in overtime, 28-27. But they get to go play another team we should consider, Pitt. It's going to be a home game in Dallas. Number 18 Pittsburgh, 7-0, undefeated, obviously, in the conference. They had that incredible game with Syracuse where poor Kyle McCord, like, he was having a good season. Now everyone's just going to remember those 5 picks, 3 of which were pick sixes. That was a game to forget for him. And then, of course, I'll just mention them. Army, they're still out there. Navy got. For those who didn't watch, Navy not only turned over the ball 5 times, but almost all of them were unforced errors. They literally would just watch a handoff and throw the ball on the turf. But Army, though, they had a bye, probably going to win again because they're playing Air Force, which is coming into Michi. But those are some potential teams. What do you think?
I keep forgetting, honestly, that Tennessee isn't in our field. Like, I just keep forgetting that they're not. Obviously, a little bit of a weird start to the season. The Arkansas game was not good, but they did the thing. They went and beat Alabama. That's what was asked of them. Their schedule also reminds me that I'm still very depressed that NC State ended up being as bad as they've become, but that's a little beside the point. Here's the challenge for Tennessee, right? Because I think that their case right now is very good. They have to go play on the road against Georgia on November 16th. So I think part of the question for that is, how good are the chances for Tennessee if they lose that game, if they're 10-2? I think they're still in decent shape, but what's been complicated this year is that there are so many one-loss teams that have a chance. I mean, we're talking about, you mentioned Notre Dame, right? That's a team that still has a chance with one loss. We have right now 2 teams in the Big 12 that are undefeated. And we have an undefeated ACC team in Miami, along with one-loss teams, and undefeated ACC teams with Pittsburgh and Miami, along with one-loss teams in SMU and Clemson. And they're not guaranteed to pick up more losses. This, I think that heading into the year, my assumption was if you're a 10-2 team, you are generally a lock to make the field. That was my general opinion, especially in the Big 2 conferences, the Big 10 and the SEC. I don't know how confident I feel in that anymore.
The team that kind of put itself back in the picture in that way for me, and not only because they won, but how they won, was Alabama. Because suddenly they came back and absolutely obliterated another contender.
I think that Missouri might be terrible. I think that Missouri might be completely awful. And definitely their backup quarterback situation with Drew Pine coming out there, that was a disaster. So, I mean, I'm curious, the vibe that I got from Alabama people was not, oh goody, we're back. That was not the vibe that I got from people. It was much more Missouri's got some problems, don't they? They are in big trouble, aren't they? So I'm a little more hesitant, I'd say, on Alabama. I think that with the way that they've played, not just the results that they've had, I feel like they kind of need to earn their way back in a little bit more by doing something affirmative instead of just hey, other teams are dropping out and we beat a hapless Missouri team that probably isn't even top 40 in the country right now. So that's kind of where I am on them. They have a chance in 2 weeks to play their way in when they travel on the road to go play LSU. I think if they win that game convincingly, then that makes this a much more interesting discussion. But I don't know. Notre Dame is also really interesting
I keep
because
forgetting they're not in either. We eliminated them last week.
we eliminated them. Notre Dame's interesting because they have one extremely bad data point, an extremely bad data point. They lost against Northern Illinois. Other than that, they have been consistently really impressive. I think that you look at their win over Texas A&M, suddenly that looks a lot better. I think that, I don't even know if we put Texas A&M up for a vote this week, but that's another team, right? That I think sooner rather than later will have a chance to enter the conversation, depending on how. Oh, actually, wait, they're already in.
Yeah,
They're already in.
We put them in
Never
last
mind.
week.
Yeah, they're already in. There are too many teams that have been in and out so far, man. Like we are getting to the nose to the grindstone. We might have to reset a little bit next week and kind of set up our contenders heading into the college football playoff rankings. But Notre Dame has that win. They beat Louisville, who's not awesome but isn't terrible. Navy is a team that is, I think, a top 30 team in the country right now. Yeah, I don't know. I'm all over the place because I feel like with all of these teams, there are teams that have some great highs and some terrible lows. And then there are some teams that have some very good high middles. And I don't know, from your perspective, what do you value more?
It's a great question, and I can't help but looking at especially the AP poll and seeing where we're missing teams. And I know why we removed some of them. Notre Dame was last week's kind of sacrificial lamb, not because they had lost, but just because we weren't as impressed with what happened, especially with Georgia Tech. And we said, down the line they'll get an opportunity to prove it with Navy, which was a disappointing game to say the least. And part of it was Navy just kind of, as we said, literally dropped the ball. They do have the games. I mean, the Florida State game again. No one's fault. It's Florida State isn't that great. Virginia, whatever. Both of those are going to be home games for the Irish. Then they get that intriguing game against Army in Yankee Stadium. And then finally they wrap up at USC. While USC is 4-4, all their games have been close. It could be, I don't expect Notre Dame to run away with a game like that. I expect that to be a close win if they're going to pull that one off. So that would at least be theoretically a challenge. It's difficult. They have one of the hardest situations, I think, to put them back on, only because they simply don't have the same caliber of opponents. I think, with Tennessee, they're going to, as you said, play at Georgia. And again, their rivalry with Vanderbilt's actually kind of exciting this year. They have a bigger upside in getting in. With the rest, I mean, again, I know I mentioned, I'm very curious. I'm not saying we should put either one in the field right now. But the winner of SMU Pittsburgh's definitely going to get a bigger eyebrow raise, next week. I don't know which one I would put in. I'm leaning a little bit towards Tennessee, only because that win over Alabama was impressive, and we didn't put them in last week. I would see them having earned their way in at this point. I mean, if we're freeing up a space and I needed to put in a team, Notre Dame is again. I'm still. Their win over Texas A&M does look better with time. That is obviously the very common understanding. But there's something about Tennessee's been better more recently, and Notre Dame has been fine, but they just haven't played anybody. And I feel bad about that. I feel like Navy's doing exactly what happens when a G5 team loses a game like that. We're like, yeah, but it was Navy. Is that what's happening?
Yeah, I mean, look, let's also remember. I mean, when we say Notre Dame hasn't played anybody, they did beat Texas A&M on the road. Like that is a top 10 win. But since then, of course, they haven't really been able to play anybody, partially because Louisville did not live up to expectations. Like they have fallen apart completely. I think that I agree with you on Tennessee. Now, I do have a feeling that Tennessee might be a 1 week addition to this list, that they might get pushed out next week for maybe Ohio State, maybe the winner of SMU Pitt, which is a game that I'll be at. But like I do think that Tennessee is probably the team right now that deserves to be in our field.
Well, then I think we've got our team. So Tennessee, congratulations, Vols. You're back in our list. to be there until you're eliminated at a later date. No, until we figure out who else we're going to remove. But Ohio State's out, Tennessee's in. We have our 12 teams: Oregon, Georgia, Penn State, Miami, Texas, Tennessee, BYU, Texas A&M, Clemson, Iowa State, Indiana, and Boise State. When we get back from the break, we're going to take another look at Ohio State and Texas just to figure out, what should we be concerned about? Should we continue to be concerned, or were these blips? When we get back here on the College Football Survivor Show.
The College Football Survivor Show, where playoff survival is always on the line.
All right, so as we kind of talked about, both Ohio State and Texas had games that they would like to forget, but they still won. They still won. And again, we eliminated Ohio State, but we're not going to eliminate them from this particular part of the conversation. What is your thoughts on this? Is this a 5-alarm fire, or are these minor blips?
Well, so let's start with Ohio State. So I think what's been weird about them over these past 2 weeks is, well, frankly, there's a couple of things, right? So first of all, I am definitely concerned about their offensive line. Josh Simmons, like we mentioned, has been a revelation, frankly, at left tackle. I saw some conversation that he could be like a first round type with the way that he had been playing so far this season. When he went out, and Nebraska has a good defense, there's no question about it. It's one of the reasons that we ultimately did vote Indiana into our field last week. But without Josh Simmons in the lineup against Nebraska, Ohio State's rushing game went 31 carries for 64 yards. And yes, sacks played a role in that, but just including the running backs, it was 20 carries for 54 yards for Quinshon Judkins and Travion Henderson. Neither had a run of more than 15 yards total the entire game. And look, I mean, part of it is, I do think that if you're Chip Kelly, I feel like, one, you got to be a little bit more willing to air it out. They actually, and some of these are sacks that impacts the number, but they were credited with 31 rush attempts to only 16 pass attempts, but they went 13 for 16 for 221 yards and 3 touchdowns when they passed the ball, right? So like, I think that you have to be a little bit more willing to just lean on your best players, who are your receivers: Carnell Tate, Jeremiah Smith.
Carnell Tate had some great catches, and even there was even a 9-yard touchdown pass to Quinshon Judkins. So even using him as a passing target, he was better than on the ground. That was mysterious, because again, for those who don't maybe remember, Josh Simmons went down against Oregon. They brought in Zen Michaels. Is it Mikalski? I was bad with names, especially with Eastern European origin names. But
Mikalski.
He came in, and he unfortunately also went down in the fourth quarter. So they did kind of triage. They moved over Donovan Jackson, and swap things around, although they didn't sound 100% committed to that. They just said, like, we were just trying to figure out how to finish out this game.
We were trying to do something.
They're trying to do something. And I know Brian Day, he said their running game isn't even close enough to being good right now. They were only converted, they were 1 on 10 on third down. They missed all 6 of the third down conversions in the second half. Prior to that, they were converting about 48% of their third down. So this was just an ugly game. And again, Nebraska's good, but not that good, at least where you'd expect that to have happened, especially against Ohio State. So this has been absolutely remarkable. I mean, again, on the plus side, Ohio State's defense was good. I mean, they had a great goal line stop in the third quarter on 4th and goal from the second. They back-to-back fourth quarter stops with the game on the line. They had that game-sealing interception by Jordan Hancock, who picked off Dylan Raiola. And they had 13 tackles for loss, which was the most. I checked; that was the most since 2021, when they actually beat Indiana 54-7. When it was your older brother's Indiana team. So again, it's fascinating to see all of this, especially knowing that they're going to be playing Penn State coming up.
Yeah, and I think that it's just been an interesting year for Ohio State, right? Like, I know that a lot of Ohio State fans have been a little underwhelmed with the pass rush so far, with Jack Sawyer and JT Tuimoloau coming back. There was expectation that this was going to be a super dynamic unit, and obviously against Oregon it wasn't. Against Nebraska it was a little bit better, but like, it's just been a lot of floating so far this year, right? Akron, Western Michigan, Marshall, Michigan State, even that game against Iowa. Like, you just didn't have to get past second gear. And there was this expectation, including from me. And I, again, like my midseason pick was still for Ohio State to win the national championship. Like my expectation was, okay, they have that gear that they'll put down against better opponents. And it just hasn't really happened to this point. Um, it's interesting, right? One thing that, and this is just me, and I'm, watching several games at the same time. Certainly, Ohio State fans would be watching closer. It was so confusing to me the amount of times that they went left running the ball behind their backup left tackle. You know what I mean? Like it just feels like one of those things. And Donovan Jackson's on that side. That's definitely a part of it, right? You're like, well, that side of the line is still pretty robust, but it challenged in so many cases the best part of Nebraska's defense, which is their edge players. Like I didn't really understand that, and obviously, look, Chip Kelly knows a lot more about tendencies and how to take advantage than me. But it just when you're having that much trouble running the ball, it feels like you want to again try to make the game easy for yourself the best way you can, and that is get the slant game involved. Again, they're 13 of 16. Like Will Howard played really well. He connected. He gave his receivers a chance, which is really all you needed to see from him in a game like this. And I just don't really know why they went away from that until, by the way, the game-winning drive when they really leaned on the passing game and just let him go to work.
Yeah, it's fascinating. I do wonder and this is one of those things I don't know if we'll ever know. But is Chip Kelly getting too creative, or does he? Is he? And it doesn't seem logical, only because we've seen how good he is when he was the offensive coordinator at Oregon. Before that, I remember he was a hot shot from New Hampshire when he became the head coach of Oregon. Obviously at UCLA, we know he is a good offensive mind. So it almost seems counterintuitive to wonder, like, is he getting too creative? Is he getting too in his head? Because there's a reason why Ryan Day was more than happy to pluck him away from his head coaching position at UCLA. But I can't quite figure it out. Is it, I was hearing one other theory, like, is it like they have all of these great weapons, but they're almost afraid to use them? It's like they collect them all and then they don't know how quite to use them, because it seems remarkable. Now, Josh Simmons is an incredible player, and I hope he gets a full recovery and all of that stuff, but this doesn't seem like one guy should not take down the whole team to the level it seems it has. And I can't make heads or tails of it. I know that's been one of the big questions for Ohio State fans and the analysis of those games. I mean, people are trying to figure out what is wrong. And again, why can't you just rely on that passing game? I mean, as you said, Will Howard is a decent passer. He is able to deliver the ball, and you have the targets. I can't make heads or tails of it.
Yeah, I know that it's been pretty obvious from the outside that Ryan Day has been in many ways taunted by what Michigan has become, and that Michigan won a national championship by just grinding teams out. And I think that you see this movement towards Ohio State just saying, we are going to grind teams out. We are going to destroy them up front. We're going to give ourselves a chance in the run game. We're going to play suffocating defense. And like, yeah, we have, the best receivers in America, but like, we're just going to take those out when we feel like it, right? But like, I just think that in some ways, I think that like there are certainly aspects. Like I expect when Ohio State gets to the college football playoff, they're going to run out some absolutely sick passing game stuff that they haven't put on film necessarily. But I think that Ohio State maybe right now is a little too optimistic about how much better they are than everybody else in some ways. And that, like, I don't know. I mean, the reality is, right? Like, Oregon was able to take advantage of their secondary. Dylan Gabriel had 326 and 2 touchdowns, 341 and 2 touchdowns. And like that was the game too, where yes, you did see Ohio State's passing game show up. They were the ones who had 326 and 2 touchdowns. But like, I don't know. I think that they have the ability to put games away early with their passing game, and they're kind of choosing not to do so. They want to follow a different game script in some ways. And sometimes, I mean, the answer is just like, just go out and win the game, man. Like, just go out and win the game. I do think against Penn State, this is an interesting matchup, and we'll go much deeper on this on Thursday's show. Penn State's secondary has been good, but not quite to the level of the last 2 years, potentially. Their numbers are good, but like they haven't been challenged as much because of just, teams haven't been able to get passes off against a really good defensive front. But like I think that Ohio State needs to spread out that secondary early and just say, no, we are willing to throw the ball around. And like, I mean, I think that for old school football coaches, there's this idea that like the run sets up the pass and that you run the ball and then you run play action and then you pass off of that. And I think that for Ohio State, with the talent that they have at receiver, like you have to be willing to go a little past creating the run. Like you have to be willing to go, no, we're going to spread out the defense and then run on you. And then, by the way, we have the best running back room in America with Quinshon Judkins and Travion Henderson. But I don't know. It just keeps feeling clunkier than it should be. And like the reality is, right? Like Ohio State doesn't lose regular season games except for that one at the end of the year. In fact, the loss against Oregon earlier this year was the first loss against a Big Ten team since I believe 2018. I don't think that Ryan Day had lost another game to a Big Ten opponent that wasn't Michigan since 2018. So like this isn't a team that's completely untouchable by the rest of the Big Ten, and I think that they've got to adjust to that.
I do wonder how much of this, and I say this somewhat facetiously, like are the decisions, strategic decisions on offense, just the legacy of Lou Holtz living in Ryan Day's head rent free? Like, no, we are physical, damn it, we're physical, like, all right,
Yeah.
we don't listen to Lou, all right, we believe you, Coach Day, but you do have good receivers. Why not rely on them? I completely agree. Now, Texas, boy, oh boy. So that loss to Georgia was ugly. We've talked about that. And then they had a pretty sloppy game against Vanderbilt. And Vanderbilt was trying their hardest. And don't get me wrong. And, fantastic just game all around. But again, talent levels, things like that. But the problem was Texas was up at halftime. And it felt like issues we had last season. They just couldn't quite put it away. Quinn Ewers, I'm not sure what's going on there. He didn't play terribly, but he had 2 interceptions. I'm not sure if that oblique injury that obviously sidelined him earlier in the season is affecting this play. I always wonder their game against Georgia, how much did the Arch Manning experiment kind of maybe get in his head a little bit? And their offensive line was once again kind of the weakest link for the team. They gave up, I believe, 4 sacks, 9 tackles for loss, and then they made boneheaded errors like holding calls that also would negate some of the offensive moves. But again, credit to Vandy though. They saw what worked for Georgia, and they pressured the quarterback 40% of the time on his dropbacks. That was the highest pressure rate that Ewers has ever dealt with. After seeing Georgia in the high 30s, was able to get those results. It's interesting to see. And the defense was so, but clearly, I think some of the concerns have been on the Texas offense. What were your takeaways from that game?
Yeah, I think it's interesting, right? I think that when you look at Texas, I mean, they were able to, in so many ways, jump on Vanderbilt. They got off to a really fast start. Actually, Quinn Ewers completed 18 passes in a row at one point. But it has been in some ways like a focus issue with this team, right? And I think that what makes Vanderbilt so good and so tough to prepare for is just their ability to take advantage in the margins. And they did that, of course, in the win over Alabama. But this is what they've also done, frankly, all year long, is they just take advantage in the margins. So, yeah, I mean, I do think that the biggest concern for me right now, like with Ohio State, is just that this offensive line, which has been deservedly credited as one of the best in the country, suddenly just looks awfully mortal. Against Georgia, of course, they just get completely destroyed by some really good edge rushers, frankly. But then when you start to look at this Vanderbilt game, it wasn't necessarily that they were getting all the way to the quarterback. They only allowed 2 sacks in this game, but there were consistent pressures, right? 10 pressures, 6 hurries, 2 quarterback hits. Like, it was a lot. They were called for 5 penalties in this game, which hasn't really been a huge thing with this team when it comes to false starts and holdings and things like that. So this was billed as one of the best offensive lines in the country, if not the best. And if that's not going to be the case, I think that that's a huge deal for Texas heading into the rest of their schedule.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting to see how much they can retool. They got this bye week coming up. Um, it's fascinating, as we've said it before, and I just repeat it again. Like Texas seemed to be the one team that seemed to be unstoppable this season, particularly after the first several weeks and watching some of the hiccups. Um, that Michigan game, as you said, it's amazing to think Michigan was a top 10 team at the time. Uh, yeah, they should be able to go. So, if you were to take a look at Ohio State and Texas, which team has you the most worried?
Well, I think that's an interesting question, right? So I think that Ohio State just has more answers on their team. That's been my assumption coming into the year. It's why I had them as my national championship pick before the season and why I kept them like that in the middle of the season. I think that Texas has a few things that probably aren't going to completely be solved. One of those things is I think that their running game is just not going to be elite because of some of the injuries that they have at running back. And I think Trey Wisner has stepped up in a big way for them, but like I don't think he's going to give them Jonathan Brooks production. I don't think he's going to give them Bijan Robinson type production, right? Like they're going to be good at the position, not great. And that puts a lot of pressure on Quinn Ewers. And I don't know how well he's dealt with that over the past 2 weeks. 2 interceptions in this game against Vanderbilt. And good performance, not necessarily standout performance. I think that Ohio State also just has clearer mismatches on their team. Their receiver room is ridiculous. Like nobody in college football right now has a receiver room like what Ohio State has. Texas has a very good receiver room. DeAndre Moore was the latest guy to step up, but of course it has been at different points. Isaiah Bond, who didn't play this past week, I think it was relevant. We've seen great things from Ryan Wingo at times, but like it's a collection of very good pieces, whereas Ohio State is 2 or 3 like incredible pieces, right? Like untouchable type pieces. So I think that I lean towards Texas being in a little more trouble than Ohio State. Both probably still make the field, right? Both probably still make the field.
Well, it's interesting
But I
too
don't know.
because which of those teams has an easier path? Is it
Yeah.
Texas? Because Texas, really, that A&M game is by far the big one in the
Yes.
circle right now. But when we look at Ohio State, they actually have a couple of tough ones. They got Penn State obviously coming up this weekend, and Indiana, which has been a
Yep.
shocker.
Yep.
And I will just say this: it's a rivalry game. I fully expect Ohio State to still win, but you never
They
know.
better.
Michigan
They better.
seems to have picked a quarter. I'm not going to say it's found a quarterback. That is overstating it. They seem to have picked a quarterback. Uh, but I mean, there are still 3 weird games there that could go their way. While with Texas, there's one game I'm even remotely concerned about because Florida. I mean, now Billy Napier could absolutely potentially save his entire seat, like save his job if he pulls that one off. I'll say that right now. But
I would highly encourage. Well, so you might point to Florida. I think Kentucky's just a disaster right now.
yeah,
That at
Arkansas.
Arkansas game, again, Texas should win. They should win by
Rivalry game.
14 plus points. But yeah, Arkansas freaking hates Texas. People don't understand how much Arkansas hates Texas. They left the Southwest Conference to get away from Texas. They do not like them. They've played a lot of historic games over the years. It's kind of a generational thing where like young Arkansas fans are like, who cares? And older Arkansas fans are like, go to hell. And it's just like, I think that that's going to bring back a lot of juice. Arkansas is tricky to game plan against. They've got a quarterback in Talon Green who isn't Diego Pavia, but like does a lot of stuff. He's more of a runner than Diego Pavia is, which causes a lot of issues. He's very like he has great vision to kind of know what to do next. Texas should not lose that game, to be clear. But like that's the other piece too, is that Ohio State has 2 marquee games left, But I think that Texas's non-marquee games are also a little trickier. And so this is one last thing too. I feel like both will make the field. I do feel like both will make the field. But what are we looking at from the perspective of two lost teams this year? Like how safe in general is a 10-2 SEC or Big Ten team? Because I would have said before the year, like those teams would be a lock. Well, I mean, I've already started to see conversation about Indiana being 11-1 and not being a lock.
Oof.
And like, I think that they would make it in, but like Penn State, I don't think, I mean, I think that they're probably a lock, but it's more about where they started than where they finished. And even let's look around the rest of college football, right? Like we might get a one-loss Clemson. We might get a one-loss SMU. Like Pitt is probably only going to be a one-loss team. They're going to be, I think, more than 10 one-loss or fewer teams in college football this year, just because of how some of the weirdness has worked out. So is a 10-2 team, and again, let's just think for 1 second. This is Texas going on the road and losing to Texas A&M. That's what we're assuming in this hypothetical. They'd have a win over Vanderbilt. Their second best win would be at Arkansas. Like it's really like you start looking at the resume and you're like, there's just so many teams. Like
I have to say though, it is wonderful that we'll have a potential for a late season disaster. Like we're going to see a team that thought they were in no matter what completely get shocked in the final week, especially when we're talking. And I mean, it may not be any of the teams we're talking about, but there will be less sympathy from the general public because unlike the Florida State debacle last season, this is talking about the 11th or 12th spot, depending on where the G5 team
But I think what's going to make it crazier is that it could be a team like Texas.
Yep.
Like it could be a team. So even though, again, like people will just say to them, well, like don't lose 2 games, which is accurate. But like people are also going to be like, well, but like look at Texas and the advanced numbers. How are they behind Indiana? How are they behind 12-1 BYU? I don't get it. And like the reality is, like if we want to care about resume, like we have to care about resume. And so this is what makes all of this so interesting and weird, and this is why I'm also endlessly curious how the playoff committee starts things out, because I want to get a feel, right? If you go into the next couple weeks, right? Like Texas moved down to number 6 in the AP Top 25 after they won not all that convincingly on the road against Vanderbilt, because frankly, the AP Top 25 looked at their schedule and didn't see a whole lot to like. Does the playoff committee have them 8 or 9? Like, I think that would be totally reasonable. They're off this week, by the way. They don't have an opportunity to pick up a data point this week. But like, I think that it would be very like reasonable for the playoff committee to be like, nah, you're 7, 8, 9. You're not 4. You're not 2. You're not number 1 like you were a couple of weeks ago. And again, similar deal with Ohio State, where you lost your marquee game. Now, the difference is Ohio State will have this Penn State game, won or lost, so it'll be kind of decided for them. But like for Texas, I am really curious how the committee handles them, because if you put them at 9 or 10, like I don't think that they can sustain a second loss.
Lots of excitement. I cannot wait to see how that turns out. Well, we've had a nice, I think, run here for this episode. We'll go ahead and wrap this one up and save some conversation for next episode. Just want to thank all of y'all for listening. Thank our producer, Joey Aliberti. Be sure to like, rate, and subscribe to us wherever you get your podcasts. And you can find us on X and TikTok at CFB Survivor Show. He's Shehan J. Raja. You can find his work on CBSSports.com and at Shehan J. Raja on X and TikTok. I'm Bobak Hayeri, part of the group that runs Reddit CFB. Thanks for listening.
The College Football Survivor Show, where playoff survival is always on the line.